Before I open up the floor for questions, I think it's only fair, now that I asked Andy a question, he wasn't expecting that, that we really do address his question. And so Andy Wheatley from DFID is asking a question in relation to the resourcing point that you made, Francesca. And he said, is there a problem with staff being underskilled which limits the capacity to assess, use, learn from accountability and feedback mechanisms, especially in data analysis? I don't know if you've found that in your work. Staff just don't have the skills to be able to do this.
Yeah, I can share where that observation came from, and why we actually end up prioritizing this feature quite a bit in terms of what are the ingredients that makes an effective feedback mechanism. The most successful example that we have seen are those where, and this is, I think, problematic, there is a lot of leadership and championing that happens at the individual level because of the initiative of a single program manager, could be the M&E officer or the mill officer. Very often there is a supporting organizational environment, so there may be some policy, and maybe at the broader organizational level there is more exposure to discuss why this is important and why skills and analytical skills, especially to deal with qualitative data that is harder to quantify, summarize, and make usable. What we found out is that the best initiatives are often boils down to the leadership and championing of a single individual. This unfortunately makes for very successful feedback mechanism that is very challenging to scale up. Very challenging to replicate across context or across team. It makes for very effective feedback mechanism in that context, in the program where they work. Very often there is a personal commitment from the part of the program manager or the team leader who actively think how to work with scarce resources in strengthening those skills. Very concrete example that we have seen during our visit in Sudan was a part of the M&E team working, one of the M&E team that we visited while there. They take turn in job rotation. They get the possibility of accompanying field monitoring teams to understand data collection, analysis, and sorting at the different points in the cycle, so that they can understand better the job of their other colleagues. So they do not work in silo. They work as a team where everybody can rotate and receive some job shadowing and coaching opportunity from the team leader. Unfortunately, so far what we have seen is that when resources need to be allocated for additional feedback processing, this often requires computer literacy skills and qualitative data analysis skills that are often in shortage, and very often it boils down to the initiative and the coaching and shadowing on the job learning that the team leader can do, which doesn't make easy to translate and scale up.
Do you want to
I
comment
would
on
love
that,
to share actually thoughts on the rather more important question on whether we need formal or informal mechanisms. Would that be all right?
Go ahead.
I think we need to be, first of all, be careful about the term informal, because different people understand different things. And as far as I understand, the way you define it is that the practice of receiving and responding to feedback is embedded in program and staff work on a day-to-day basis. That's informal. Whereas a formal is, it's established as a dedicated function, supported by some level of structure and procedures. Informal can be misunderstood to be more face-to-face mechanisms, but actually I want to highlight that we have some formal mechanisms that also rely on face-to-face mechanisms. Yeah, so let's just make that distinction clear. In terms of the question, I think as a matter of principle, we should strive to have both formal and informal mechanisms. Because what we want to achieve is regular, systematic listening to communities and responding, adapting, and learning as a result of what we hear. We can start doing this via ensuring regular presence in the communities, building relationships, listening and proactively seeking feedback as part of our programming work. This is the minimum we should be striving to do, the minimum. And this is also, I think, the prerequisite for setting up formal feedback mechanisms. Through relationship building, we earn a community's participation and their candid feedback. via informal mechanisms, we demonstrate that we're willing to listen and are ready to respond. Then, with formal mechanisms, we provide more reliable and multiple outlets for people to share issues that they may not want to share with us in a certain setting or with a certain individual, etc. When we have both formal and informal, then we should ideally be picking up and responding to much of the day-to-day feedback via the informal interactions in meetings and such. But then the more serious issues are coming to us via the more formal mechanisms, which make the formal mechanism more manageable and less of a burden. So therefore, I hesitate to champion relying only on informal mechanisms for a number of reasons. Because the feedback we receive via general program meetings, M&E exercises, may not always get recorded. Or they may not likely be followed up or a response given to the complainant. Or because they're part of other data, it's difficult to pull that feedback information out to streamline and analyze it and look at trends. Another issue with informal mechanisms is that because they rely on interaction with our staff or representatives, some sensitive issues can be dropped intentionally or unintentionally. The staff, if what they're hearing is something that reflects negatively on them, they might want to suppress that, and it never gets escalated. Another issue with informal mechanisms is that people may not feel comfortable reporting some issues in person to us. They rely on our physical presence. So what happens when we're not there? A lot of the formal mechanisms are there when we are physically not there. And also, as you said, they are dependent on the drive of individual staff, so they're not very sustainable. When that staff moves on, those dialogues might cease to exist. Lastly, if we want to pick up serious issues around fraud and safeguarding, especially around sexual exploitation and abuse by our own staff and representatives, then we have to have formal mechanisms in place so we can protect the complainant as well as our staff. For all these reasons, I think we need to be careful about championing only formal mechanisms. And we should strive to have both. Having said that, there might be situations where we can't have both. There might be contexts like Somalia, for example, where we don't have access and we have to have a formal mechanisms in place, like an SMS service or a hotline, whereby people can reach us. The same thing with, cultural issues reaching women. We might have to have separate mechanisms for them, formal mechanisms for them to be able to hear from them. Lastly, having talked about the disadvantages of informal mechanisms, I can also say a couple of things about how formal mechanisms can be risky and even do harm. Say, for example, if we're operating a program with limited resources and staff capacity, and as a result, we've not managed to have regular presence in the communities and build relationships and do participatory programming. If, in such a situation, we go in and set up formal mechanisms, I think we end up doing harm. I think this is risky. Because all of a sudden, that mechanism is seen to be the only outlet for people to get in touch with the agency. And that mechanism gets inundated with information requests, requests for assistance, complaints and feedback about the program, complaints about the government services or other NGOs, anything and everything. And so we're already under-resourced, and now we have to find staff time to record and respond to these. And in most cases, we cannot afford to do that. And we can't respond, and this ends up damaging our image and trust with the communities. So I think the informal and formal mechanisms need to work together. We need to find resources for both. If we can't, then at minimum we should be doing the informal, but we must try to record what comes through those. And that's why we've kind of made these feedback forms to kind of facilitate that. But this will likely give us limited information and not the most sensitive major issues that are more grave breaches of our accountability. If we decide to rely only on informal mechanisms, we have to acknowledge taking that risk of not picking up these serious breaches of accountability and missing out on organizational learning.
Lovely.
That's it.
Thank you very, very much. We've got some very interesting questions online, but let me open it up to the floor, please. And could you say who you are? And if you represent an organisation, could you say who it is? Sir, please, I think you were first. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Sarfraz, and I am from Pakistan. And I've been working in flood 2010, flood 2011, and in other emergencies. It is very fascinating work, and it is required in the field indeed, in a great desperate situation where we need more and more such activity in the field. But I must say that it is a huge task, and what you have started is just a tip on the iceberg. I tell you briefly that in 2010 floods, there were 477 organizations working for humanitarian aid. And Save the Children was one of them, Plan International was one of them, IOM was one of them. And that was a huge problem with monitoring and feedback system. So the real problem was not that there was no system, but the real problem was there was too many, and they were too contradictory to each other, because every recipient organization in the community has to report to the donor. They have their own different forms. They have to report to UN system. They have their own different forms. They have to report OCHA office. They have their own different forms. They have to report cluster system. They have their own forms. And then they have to be answerable to government. And government was not only at one level, federal level, but federal government has its own feedback system. Provincial government has its own feedback system, and district and local government has its own feedback system. So one organization who is getting some kind of funding from DFID or from UN has to report to too many organizations. And that funding which they had demanded, for example, in water and sanitation, we got a tune of $244 million request from the organizations. And nobody got 100%. Every organization gets 75%, 50%, 20% what they asked for. So how they are going to arrange for budgeting for feedback when they are not able to do the necessary things which they have to provide? So my suggestion would be, is there any way you could do a unilateral system or consolidating all this feedback and monitoring system, which is useful for the donor and agreeable from the donors, because donors don't want to accept. European Union would say we want different, DFID would say we want different, UN would say we want different. So is there any way you can bring them together on a one system of feedback and monitoring, which is acceptable to all? And second is there any way that it could be monitored from outside the country? Because inside the country, what happened to Save the Children, I fully agree, they have worked a lot, although it was a very small proportion, but their people were prisoned. They were asked to leave the district because they were doing something which was not liked there. So there must be a system outside the country, beyond the preview of the country office, and beyond the preview of the country government, which is capable of monitoring so that it has no conflict of interest.
Thank you very much. Wouldn't it be wonderful if there was just one form that we all had to fill in? That would be a wonderful world that would be. Sir, please, at the back. Thank Thank you.
Thanks very much, and thanks particularly to Francesca. I thought it was a fantastic and very concise presentation. Just a couple of comments. My name's Dave Hampson. I work with the Food and Agriculture Organisation, FAO, based in Senegal, on accountability in the Sahel and soon East Africa as well. 10 days ago, I was working with people from about 20 NGOs, training 40 people in mechanisms at community level, and very much focusing, as Alex, I think, was saying, on the barrier that people have to dealing in communities because it's difficult, or it's perceived as difficult. And what I was attempting to work on was the confidence of people doing it. And what I've always found in this kind of work is when you ask people if they've used participatory methodologies, no one's used them. But everyone's been trained in them 3, 4, 5, 6 times, and this is all, 30, 40, 50 years old. There's nothing new about, what Paulo Freire was doing. So it's about getting people to practice in a safe environment and then taking people to communities and getting them to work with communities and find out that it's not actually that difficult. I always start my sessions saying, why would my title be accountability to affected populations? And people scratch their heads a bit. And eventually people come up with the answer that we're already accountable to donors because they're powerful. And it's the political aspect of working to people who are more powerful than us. We're in fact probably fairly craven when we deal with our donors. We don't say to our donors what we would want from them in terms of the time lag between when they're telling us to plant seeds and when it has to be in the ground. And we're fairly haphazard at community level. And it's a difficult balance, and it's not to say donors are bad and we're good. There's good and bad everywhere. We're human beings. But the accountability lack is definitely at community level because those people don't have any power over us. And thirdly, on the formal and informal question, I recently did an evaluation for an NGO, which I won't name, but the formal systems failed to pick up abuse because it was in the power interests of staff. And I happened to, it was a very sub-point of what I was doing, but I mentioned the corruption that was happening, and it was picked up on by the fraud squad of that organisation, and it was dealt with. However, at a higher level, what I was doing, the report that was supposed to go on the internet and be published, wasn't, because it was considered washing dirty linen. And we're all in that environment. We all have the competition elements as well as the collaborative elements. And how we get to a situation where people can be honest about their own organisations and share things that are not going well as that are going well, not necessarily pointing fingers and saying this is bad and those people did it wrong, but here's a real case study without the name of the organisation, and how can we do this better, and how can we have continual improvement. And I think the stream that runs through all those 3 points is the political stream, because we're all political animals, we all have our jobs, we all have our interests. We should be ourselves, we should be servants and not masters in this process. We're basically taking taxpayer money that's given unwittingly and doesn't hold the politicians accountable, and which is being spent at the level of communities who essentially will accept whatever they're given as long as it's net positive, because they're not sufficiently involved in the process. So it's always to me about the power and trying to work out what our own power sources are and how we can hand over power and how we can share our real life situations. And thank you for the panel members who've been honest about the problems from within, because we all have our own problems from within. Thanks.
Dave, thank you. We're going to go down the line here, but just before we do, because you've been talking about washing dirty linen in public, we have a question online, very, very similar to the points you're making, so I'll just repeat it. Again, it's from a gentleman, DFID, Andy Wheatley, and he asks the question, is not the core problem that monitoring and feedback mechanisms generate inconvenient and negative information, and thus is a measurement of failure, washing our dirty laundry in public? It's bad enough doing this internally and takes much more self-confidence than to share externally. in brackets, and God forbid with donors, requires even more confidence in your approach. And so I hope that's Difford saying, you know, be honest and we'll understand. I hope so. So we go down the line there. Thank you.
Adam Groves from Bond. It's kind of slightly picking up from the last point, but I was struck by a report on Radio 4 recently showing that in the private sector, customer feedback is acted upon a lot more quickly if it's shared on Twitter. And as you were speaking, Alex, I was wondering what the management response would be if the people you were working with and for started posting on Twitter about
Sack them.
If your beneficiaries started posting on Twitter about their experience of your work.
That was a joke, I'd like to point out.
And I wondered if you could kind of give a sense of how you see the increasing concern with feedback developing alongside the transparency agenda, and how they might interplay to affect its efficacy.
Great. We'll take a couple more questions. We'll go down the line and then we'll come to Robert in the front row. Thanks. We'll take
Thank you. David Bombright from Keystone. So this is a complex problem, as many have noted, and in these situations, I find myself wanting to trot out my favorite quote from the 19th century American jurist Oliver Wendell Holmes, who said, I would not give a fig for simplicity on this side of complexity, but I'd give my life for simplicity on the far side. And I think when Alex said that the goal here is to create management data in ways that make recipients' views transparent to senior decision makers, he hit simplicity on the far side of complexity. But I would add not just visible to senior decision makers, but everyone in the ecosystem, so that the system as a whole can make intelligent decisions. And the key then is to develop tools that do that, practical, concrete tools. Just picking up on your point, Adam, about incentives and Twitter, in the US now, the largest charity rating agency in the world, Charity Navigator, has issued a new set of rating guidelines. And as of 2016, America's NGOs will be rated on the extent to which they publish empirically valid feedback from the people they serve. So this is a big game changer, I think, in the US space, certainly, and hopefully we'll see some movements in that direction here at the kind of structural incentives. But if I could just for a second, when it comes to these concrete tools, there's some features that we need to think about that didn't come up in the presentations. They may be in the full report, but I'd like to bring them out. Or at least they didn't come up to the way that, to the extent that they're important. Okay, the point about credible data has been made. That's critical. The data has to be credible. It has to be actionable. But if management's going to pay attention to it, it needs to be continuous. It needs to be a signal that actually shifts when you do things. So you act and you can immediately see very quickly in a very short cycle whether or not it's making a difference. And in fact, if you have a signal that is reactive to change, it becomes more credible because you can see how it's working. So you literally have feedback loops that are starting to really respond to things. Absolutely critical. Second thing is that we have to use the data that comes from feedback and triangulate it with other data that we have in order to find ways to reduce the overall reporting burden, the overall data collection burden. We have too much data we're collecting now. My estimate is that we could get rid of more than half of the data we're collecting now and get better outcomes if we learned where the pure signals were in there. And we haven't found the way to search for the less is more data. And feedback data, when triangulated with other data, can take you there. So customer satisfaction has been invoked. What happened in consumer-facing companies over the last 50 years was a huge increase in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, a massive increase in data collection, not unlike what's happened in the international NGO world. And then some very smart people said, wait a minute, this is crazy, we can't deal with all this data. And they began a search, and now, in the customer satisfaction industry, huge multi-billion-dollar companies ask one question and track it. How likely would you be to recommend this company to a friend or colleague on a scale of 0 to 10? And what they've learned is that question correlates to the things they care about: growth, customer decisions, profits, everything. So where are those where are those cut-through data points for us that can actually reduce the overall burden, give us the clean signal? We need to actually go on that journey. The last point is that, that's it, really. Just that there's a ratio that I like to use, which is what I call the data to action ratio. And we've got to actually change that ratio dramatically.
David, thank you very much. Simplicity on the far side of complexity. That's a tough one for Friday afternoon for me, but I'm sure all my panellists have got that. Robert, and then we'll come to you, madam. It's the last one.
Hi, I'm Robert Schofield. I was the HAP director for a short time, and I'm a freelance consultant now. It was just a quick question about the research, and I also really enjoyed the presentation and the fact that it was concise. So this is trying to get to a bit more detail and really brilliant discussion as well. So it was so encouraging that one of your focus was users themselves. And I'm just conscious that that is a vast group of people. So I'm interested just to understand, you know, was it, I mean, I'm sure it wasn't, but tokenistic kind of users in terms of beneficiaries and affected populations. So how were you representative in that group?
Adam, just that would be the final one there.
Yes,
if you can make,
John.
Okay. Just make it really quickly, though. Okay.
Vicky Murta from Christian Aid. I just wanted to pick up on the comment that was made about Pakistan and the fact that basically there are so many hundreds of different formats, and this is in response to 2010, 2011, etc., etc. Something that we seem to miss out on quite often is the fact that as humanitarian agencies, we don't necessarily engage on a long-term basis with communities, but our development partners do. And often what will happen is that we will invent a new complaints response mechanism for this emergency, and then what will happen is that it'll be dropped because our funding is finished and we've walked away and our staff have moved on to other jobs in different organisations. And then another emergency will happen, and then what will happen is that we'll reinvent another form. And that just confuses the communities, it confuses our staff, and it's a waste of time. So I think that it's not just about engaging unilaterally, it's also about engaging with our development sector to make sure that there is this consistency throughout. Thank you.
Thank you. There's a lot of demand here, so it's Madara, isn't it? Is it Madara? Is it your name? Oh. Okay. Could you make it quick? That would be great.
My name is Delia Bajongwe, and I've worked with both international NGOs and local organizations. And just picking up on most of the points, it's also about perception in terms of international NGOs just come in and out, and we're supposed to receive from them, and they don't want to hear from us. So at times, I've worked in a Zimbabwean context where NGOs are politicized and kind of think, and people think that whatever you say is going to be a political thing, even though you're saying, no, I feel as if we don't get enough food or something like that. So I would say sometimes people should think about desensitizing communities in terms of what feedback really is and who's listening and what the information is going to be used for.
Thank you very much. The last one, I know, man, you've been waving your hand for some time and I haven't seen it, but I have now.
Hi, my name's Hauer, and I work independently, mainly in sub-Saharan Africa. I just wanted to thank the panellists for really giving us a sense, holistically, I guess, of some of the challenges around feedback and making sure that that feedback feeds back into a programming cycle. I wanted to really draw on the analogy that you used around the feedback loop. And I'm a learning practitioner, and for us learning practitioners, we talk about double loop learning. So in double loop learning, you're also wanting not just to learn for the purpose of doing business as usual, but because you actually fundamentally want to see some kind of change. And I think the point that Alex made around management incentives is quite key. I mean, I've been practicing for well over 15 years now, I guess. There are plenty of tools to engage and empower communities, young people, disabled people, women, you know, you name it, other minorities. The problem is that there are kind of organizational bottlenecks and that the funding mechanisms don't really want to hear maybe fully what the end users are saying.
Yes.
So I guess my question back to the panel is, what would a management incentive really look like? Because I do believe that the tools are, they're there. They might not all be within the humanitarian sector, but certainly within the development sector, within the community empowerment sector, within the feminist movement. All of the tools are there, but the issue is what do we do with it and how do we incentivize them?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, double loop learning may be scary, but triple loop learning is even worse, because that's transformational change, isn't it? It seems to remember. We haven't got long left. I wonder, with your permission, could I just extend the discussion for 15 minutes? Is that okay? If you do need to go, please do. But I think we haven't really got to the bottom of this yet, have we? So I'm just going to take 2 more questions, really quick ones, from the online participants, and then it's over to you 3. But we'll start with a question from Annie Devonport from the DEC, and this is directly posed to you, Francesca, and she asked, did the research throw up any unexpected findings, or were they in line with what was expected? And then there's a gentleman from Mike Klein from the International Solutions Group, who is one of our latest ALNAP full member organisations. Hello, Mike. And he asks, additional details on the point of data collection forms would be appreciated. Specifically, any information on what role ICT, you mentioned that, didn't you, is playing in this capacity. There's lots and lots and lots and lots of questions. Please don't try and answer them all. You can choose. It's a kind of a la carte menu for you, So please, if we start with Alex, just comment on one of these.
Let me try to draw a couple of the points together. I thought that was fantastic. A great range of questions. Thank you very much for those. About the point where we started, about the range of reports and the potential for a unilateral system, about the point that communities don't have power over us and how we could change that, which relates to the management incentives, which has been a thread running throughout. So with the management incentives, related to what David said and his work, a continuous signal requires quantitative data. And that was why I put so much emphasis on the formal feedback systems, though I very much agree with Burju that we need both, no question. But formal systems can generate quantitative data, and quantitative data around satisfaction has the potential to change the incentives in the system, to change the power that different actors have. So if, for instance, managers' performance was assessed to some extent based on client satisfaction, that would change the game. If it was changed from, if managers' performance was based on women's satisfaction feedback, that would have powerful implications for our efforts around gender mainstreaming in a way that more courses on on gender awareness simply won't. So I think that's why I made the comments I did earlier on, that formal systems that generate quantitative data on a continuous basis on the things that matter most, maybe that does have the potential to change the management incentives. If something like that could appear on that list that I showed you about the country office KPIs, just imagine how that would change management practice and then programming practice. It's not a perfect solution, but to be honest, we're probably not in the game of perfect solutions. It would make, I believe, a massive difference. Now, how we do it is not easy, and I think that's part of the collective endeavour we're all involved in. And one aspect of that, I think, relates to the first comment that was made about the reporting burden. So in the Philippines, in the response to the typhoon, one of the things that a number of agencies here are looking at is what we've called a common services project, which is a bit of a mouthful, but I think it's got real potential. And the idea is, suppose a number of the big humanitarian agencies all used the same mechanisms for what we loosely call accountability, for accountability to affected populations. Suppose one of those was a common customer satisfaction tool that generated comparable data. Then we could compare performance between agencies. That would be powerful. Nothing like a league table for getting people's attention. We all assume we're going to be in the top half, but that's not going to be possible. It would greatly simplify what we're asking our staff to do, so it reduces the need for training and developing our own tools. It greatly reduces the burden on the people we're asking these questions to, so we don't need to keep coming up with different forms for this and that and the other. And it would generate the big picture. We could put it all together and say, well, this is the pattern of feedback and satisfaction across the entire response. Again, we're not going to achieve all of that in a one-er, but I think that the potential to use the same tools across the sector is incredibly powerful, and we're starting to move that way. And to my mind, this is some of the most exciting aspects of a new agenda for HAT and some of the other accountability mechanisms, which I really hope will be taken forwards. I think we should have an eye on the World Humanitarian Summit here. And if we could get to a point where we're saying, if you are taking international money, then you will have to use these tools, so long as they're good enough, and be transparent in these ways, then potentially that does really change the whole game. Thank you.
Alex, thank you. I wondered how long it would take before somebody mentioned the World Humanitarian Summit, so well done. Please.
Shall I? Yes, or I can take perhaps one on the unexpected findings. That was the question from Annie. Thank you, Annie. And perhaps it is interesting if I pick this question because it can touch on some of the points and the concern that the gentleman from who has worked in Pakistan was sharing of a great number of organizations descending in the moment when there is a response with multiple systems. One of our unexpected findings, and actually it is coming from the Pakistan context, there are a few, but I'm picking this one because it's relevant, is that we found, to our surprise, that there are existing ongoing practices that are based on interagency, trust, information sharing, and resource sharing. Passing on information, sharing resources, and conducting together a field visit, making sure that the forms and the data that is collected, it is harmonized to what other agencies are doing. We have seen this in Pakistan, interestingly, that's the point, in the context of shrinking programs. So we visited Pakistan 2.5 years after the peak of the emergencies. This is where the cluster are sort of phasing out, where you have shrinking programs, and where supposedly, and this touches on the point a colleague from Christian Aid was making, it is supposed to shift the gear to a different mode of operation, where you have organization coming with different funding and different tools with the longer time frame, ideally. We have seen this in the context of the shelter cluster, and it really works in the province. We were looking at that scene at that point, and in the context of shrinking program, we could really see some good practice in terms of resource information sharing, and also making sure that at the capital level, these messages that were collected within the cluster with different agencies and partners catering to different needs and cross-cutting issues, they were also heard from the capital level. And so it is an interest, it was very striking to see. And they were doing this in the context of a rather informal way of working in the cluster. And this is because the cluster leadership at the time understood its role as a cluster lead, also in terms of facilitating this feedback and this continuous sort of validation and triangulation across agency. And so I think there is a role in terms of leadership that cluster lead can play in country, also helping the transition after the emergency is over to make sure that programs and initiatives are not dropped, such as it can happen on feedback mechanisms. So that was unexpected and positive, very often undocumented. This is possibly why a lot of good stories could be there and could be really showcased, but it's rarely happen because it is happening below the surface. So the iceberg, what you see above water level, it's usually those mechanisms who use the ICT, who use communication systems that are slightly more, visible and more publicized. What happened below the water level is equally meaningful, but underreported perhaps, or underdocumented. So that is my bringing together a few answers, hopefully.
Thank you, Francesca. Okay.
Can I say a couple of things about the point on reducing the data collection burden? If I can take you back to the Pakistan example I was giving, what was really powerful about that system is that these monitoring checklists that they use are actually really short and concise. They're about a page, close-ended yes-no questions, compiled via observations, talking to staff, and talking to communities. So the feedback comes in there. and they're asked regularly the same questions time and again. And that's where the kind of the power of that comes from, where at the end of the month, they look at it, they look at the issues that have come up, and they propose action points. And those action points are tracked. So at the end of the year, or say a quarter, they also see how many of those action points have actually been acted on in a given location, in a given program. So they can say, X district have been 40% unresponsive. They've acted on 60% of the actions, but 40% not. Whereas compared to another district that's acted on 80%. So here is maybe your management incentive. Saying, well, it's more like a stick than a carrot, but it doesn't look good. These colleagues are being a lot more responsive to course correction based on feedback from community, observations, and looking at outputs and outcomes of the program. So simple tools, simple questions asked, same questions asked over time and again, and the power of the qualitative analysis that gives us this powerful information. I think that's a great example.
I'm really glad you said that, and I'll tell you why, because now I think I know what simplicity on the far side of complexity is. Is that it?
Be careful what you think you know.
Okay. Very true. I stand slightly corrected. I think. I'm not sure. Would anyone like the last word? Has anyone got a burning thing they'd like? Yes, madam.
What about the people who can't be reached because of oppressive regimes?
Yes.
Some people, aid agents, people don't want material resources. They want only your voice, only your voice at the international fora. Because I am from Sri Lanka, the north of Sri Lanka.
Yes.
There are, the government has been oppressing the people, and they have been preventing the UN, ICRC and other agents from helping the people. Now, they don't allow even India to build houses for the war-ravaged people, but they are making them build something in the south. Because of this geopolitics, short-term geopolitics, because Sri Lanka is siding with China, the US or India is trying to get Sri Lanka tilt towards them. But the government has now prohibited the diaspora from helping the people. So the people have the diaspora to help them, but there is a block, there is a barrier. If that barrier can be removed, the diaspora can help them. They don't want other people's money. The big, rich people's money, they don't want. They want the opportunity to help those people who are under the very boots of the army right now.
Yes. Thank you very much for just putting some of this in the context of very, very, very difficult situations. One last point.
My point was on emotion.
Oh, okay. Well.
I mean, it is central, and you can't ignore it in humanitarian cases as well as post-disaster situations.
Yes.
You know, it's this. You're working there. You're at the epicenter of grief and loss, pride, ownership, and I'm curious to see what ways that emotion is formalized, or managing emotions internally in the organizations as well as on the ground. And so as a designer, always interested in the experience of different systems and processes, my thoughts are always on these very, very complex emotions when it comes with loss and grief and devastation. So I again wanted to thank you very much for the presentation and for the research, as well as the panel. But can't be ignored. It's something that needs presence.
Did you say who you were and who you work for? So
my name is Ayako Maruyama. I work as a designer and have a background in city planning. I work at the Design Studio for Social Intervention in Boston, Massachusetts.
Well, thank you very much. Listen, I think we've come to the end of the session. It's been a great discussion. Thank you very much. I think it sets up the bank holiday weekend perfectly. And so really I'd like to thank all of our online participants who sent in some really very, very interesting questions. I'd like to thank you all very, very much for coming. It was a great debate, lots of really, really good questions. There are some refreshments outside, and so we certainly invite you to join us in a drink afterwards. And most of all, of course, I'd like to thank our 3 panelists, and so thank you so much. Thank you very much.